All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, How Enforcement Will Audit for ELD Compliance. I'm Luke Kibbe, and I will be your moderator. Today's speakers are Tony Hugo, Director of Safety, and Dave Gray, President of Glowstone Trucking Solutions. But before we get started, I wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is interactive, so please use the chat box to submit your questions at any time. Some questions might be a little long, so please write them down ahead of time before the Q&A session at the end. I will be monitoring the questions, and like I said, we'll have a Q&A session at the end to go over the questions. We will also mute all phones as there is a lot of static with many people on the line, so again, please use the chat box if you have any questions. Also, finally, you will receive the recording of the webinar after it is over, along with the slides and any other information that we get from the presentation. So keep an eye out on your email. With that, let's get started. I'm excited to introduce our first speaker, Dave Gray. Welcome, Dave, and take it away.
All right, Luke, thank you. So before we get started into the enforcement aspect of the ELD, which is Tony's area of expertise, I thought I would quickly review what we covered in our webinar from last month, where we kind of started with what is an ELD and the kind of the good, bad, and the ugly that can happen with it using an ELD. So just a quick recap to get us started. And first off, I want to make sure there's a lot of gossip going around the fuel pumps out there that seem to think that the Trump administration will kill the ELD mandate. And I said it last month, and I still believe it today, is that this ELD mandate is going to happen. It was part of MAP 21. It was passed by Congress. It's law. And, you know, half the industry, trucking industry, supports the ELD mandate, and the other half hates it. So with kind of a mixed bag there, the general feeling that we're probably 95% sure this thing is going to become effective December of this year. So the ELD is still going to happen, we think. So what is an ELD? Electronic logging device, and it's a term coined by the FMCSA, and it is a very specific set of programming that the FMCSA has outlined in order for it to be an ELD. It must meet all of their programming requirements, and it's specific to what the FMCSA wants. So an ELD, if a manufacturer says it's an ELD, that it complies with all of the FMCSA requirements, does not mean it's going to be sufficient for IFTA, for example. That's governed by a whole different entity. Or the International Registration Plan, again, governed by a whole different entity. So an ELD only refers to the hours of service rules that the FMCSA has passed and become operational in December of 2017. So what does an ELD do? It synchronizes with the motor, the vehicle engine, to accurately record drive time only, and I put those in caps to emphasize that it records drive time only. And not, there's 4 other duty statuses. We've got obviously on duty, not driving. We've got the sleeper berth. We've got off duty, and there is a 4th one, personal conveyance, that will be part of the ELD. But what is being recorded automatically, meaning the driver does not have to interact with it, is the ELD will know when the truck is moving and automatically put the driver into driving time. And it'll also measure the time that the truck has stopped. If it stops more than 5 minutes, it's going to ask the driver, are you done? And if the driver does not interact with it, it's going to change the driver status to on duty. And it will stay in on duty unless the truck begins moving again, which then it will go back to driving time. If the truck does not move again, the driver's done for the day, for example, and doesn't interact with the ELD, it's going to leave him in on duty time until the driver interacts with the ELD. So the only thing automatic about it, it's going to be recording driving time only. So who's required to have an ELD? So basically, a simple version is all drivers who are required to fill out a record of duty status, a graph log grid today, must use an ELD. And there are some exemptions, and if you meet the current hours of service log grid exemptions, for example, the 100 air mile radius for the CDL trucks, or if you're operating within the 150 air mile radius for the non-CDL trucks, the medium and light duty trucks, you can be exempt from the ELD. But there's a lot of folks that think they comply with the 150 air mile or the 100 air mile, and they actually really don't when you look at the exemption rules and you measure what they do, if they actually meet all of the criteria to claim that exemption. Just in the last few weeks, we've done some audits of companies thinking that they meet the exemption, but they really don't. You know, part of it is the driver has to be released from duty within the 100 air mile radius at 12 hours and has to restart and return to the same location. If those two things don't happen, then you don't meet the exemption requirements. And it's the same with the 150 air mile radius. It must start and stop at the same location at the end of the day, and it's a 14-hour day for the lighter duty truck. So if a company thinks it meets those, but it really doesn't, maybe the driver is released from duty, but he drives home in the commercial vehicle after the 14th hour, it's a violation and does not meet the exemption. So in trucks over 10,001 pounds is what is a regulated truck driven commercially. So an F-250, for example, pulling a trailer with product on it, or maybe it's to the job site with tools or whatever on the back, a small excavator, it can easily go over the 10,001 pounds, and those vehicles are regulated. And if they meet the exemption, then you don't have to have an ELD, but if they don't meet the exemption, an ELD is required. Other exemption is model year 2000 and older, does not have to have a ELD. Again, the ELD syncs with the engine control module, and these early model years of trucks don't always have the right engine control module, but the manufactured after 2000, they sync very well with these ELDs. And drive-away, tow-away operations don't have to have an ELD. So I mentioned the device must meet FMCSA standards, and the FMCSA has a list, a certified list, and I looked at it this morning, and there was 34 providers that have told the FMCSA that they are certified ELD. And you would think the FMCSA would check them out, but they don't. They let them self-certify, meaning I'm a programmer, I operate out of my garage, I've got maybe a cell phone that I operate from, and I have told the FMCSA that my mad wizard programming skills have created an ELD, and they will certify me and put me on the list. And if you as a carrier select me and my ELD, and I actually don't meet the requirements, then basically it's you, the carrier, that has to go and repurchase another one that does meet the requirements, or if I'm not in business a year from now and don't support the device. So there's a lot of buyer beware within selecting the right device, and we can talk about that a little bit later. So the other, next slide, yes, the ELD, good, bad, and the ugly. Again, we've kind of put it into that context last month. The good, ELDs introduce technology that really can enhance your business. The Geotab did a very extensive study. They've got 750,000 units out there and have a lot of data to work with, and they did an extensive study, and for a heavy-duty truck, 80,000 miles a year, by using all of the tools that can go along with an ELD, they were saving $1,470 in expense a month. by using all of those tools. So the good is that technology can help your business. Obviously, the bad then becomes you need to be committed to using that technology. And to be committed to using that technology, you've got to be willing to change how you do your business, because this synchronizing some of the tasks that you do manually today can be certainly brought using technology, make it much quicker and easier to do. However, that takes retraining, and change is hard, and there's a cost to it. And then finally, the ugly, if you don't commit to it and you have poor compliance with the ELD, you are going to stand out like a sore thumb to the FMCSA, and out-of-service orders will come much quicker because they can basically analyze your data. They are working on a software. It's not completed yet. This software will be able to upload your data. It could upload probably a fleet of 100 drivers for 6 months worth of logs, and probably compute the violations within 5 minutes, where the old way, doing it manually, could take weeks. So technology is going to make compliance and enforcement much more efficient. So the downside, the ugly, is getting put out of service, and out of service can lead to out of business. All right, with that as a recap, and I do believe Luke is also going to send out the link to our webinar from last month if you'd like more details. We went into much more detail on the good, the bad, and the ugly, and so that link will also be available to everyone. So with that, let's get into the next phase, is our opinions and of how enforcement is going to deal with ELDs, and I'll introduce Tony Hugo, our Director of Safety Services and also former enforcement officer for the DOT. So Tony, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Good afternoon, everyone. As Dave said, my name is Tony Hugo. I'm the Director of Safety Services here at Glowstone Trucking Solutions. Prior to coming to work with Glowstone, I worked for the Oregon Department of Transportation in the Motor Carrier Transportation Division for a little over 5 years, 5.5 years. Most of my time spent with ODOT was at the Cascade Locks Port of Entry scale on Interstate 84 east of Portland. I did about 1.5 years there as an enforcement officer, weighing trucks and enforcing size and weight and the regulations. And then the last 4 years with ODOT was in the safety department, where I conducted roadside inspections of trucks, commercial motor vehicles, and then also compliance reviews or audits of the motor carriers. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about how enforcement officers will be auditing the drivers for ELD compliance or their ELD devices, and what you as a driver can do to ensure compliance, and what the enforcement officers may be looking for from you as they audit your logbooks in an ELD device. So briefly, just going to touch on the ELD mandate and the regulatory transition. The regulatory transition has 3 phases in the ELD mandate, and phase 1 is where we currently are. It started February 16th, 2016, and continues until December 18th, 2017. So not really just around the corner, but just 9 months down the road, and we'll be into the next phase of the ELD mandate. The current phase that we're in right now is mainly about awareness and education and the transition into ELDs. This is a good time for a company to do a little research into what ELD system is going to be best for their company, find the right system for your company, and the different options that an ELD may have. Currently, it's pretty much business as usual. Everything that a motor carrier is doing right now is considered an acceptable logging. Paper logs, mobile devices, cell phones, tablets, automatic onboard recording devices. and then also the certified and registered ELDs that Dave mentioned. There's 34 of them that have self-certified at this point. Would all be considered acceptable logging methods at this time. On December 18th, 2017, we'll transition into the second phase, and this is going to be another 2-year period from December 18th to December 16th, 2019. And at that point, it just basically eliminates paper logs from acceptable methods of logging. So you're going to be able to use the ELDs that are certified and registered with FMCSA, and also automatic onboard recording devices that were pre-installed and in use prior to the December 18, 2017 date. And then we're going to move into the third phase. After December 16, 2019, all motor carriers that are subject to the rule will be required to use a ELD that's certified and registered with FMCSA. At this point, paper logs, automatic onboard recording devices will no longer be accepted as recording devices unless there's a malfunction with the ELD. One thing to keep in mind, though, is the current rule with the optional automatic onboard recording device. If the automatic onboard recording device malfunctions, then you can switch over. You are required to switch over to paper logs, and you can use those paper logs as long as it takes you to get the automatic onboard recording device repaired or replaced. With the new ELD rule, if there is a malfunction, the driver only has an 8-day window to get it repaired or replaced. So you're allowed to use paper logs for those 8 days, and on that 8th day, you have to have the automatic onboard recording, or excuse me, the ELD repaired or replaced. So it's a little bit different and a little more strict on how long you're going to be allowed to use paper logs. From a law enforcement perspective, there's going to be a little bit of a difference between enforcement command and what their intention of the ELD rule is, and how the field enforcement is going to be able to enforce those rules. You know, real life application of rules doesn't always meet what the paper or what's written on paper. There's many examples of this throughout various rules the rule on paper and the intent of the rule says one thing, but real life application doesn't quite meet what they had intended with the rules. And there's all kinds of different factors that are going to affect how the rule is enforced. So what you end up with is the FMCSA saying the rule is one thing, or intent of the rule is one, but the application and real life application of the rule ends up being something a little bit different. So I think that there's going to be a number of things that are going to influence how the rule is going to be enforced on the roadside. For some departments or agencies, there's budgets that may come into play. Some agencies may not have the resources to put the money or time into the type of system that FMCSA is going to require for the uploading of the inspections and the information or the data that's going to be gathered from the ELDs. Or they may not have the ability to thoroughly train all their staff on the various ELD systems. Like Dave mentioned, that there's going to be right now 34, and we're still 9 months away from the implementation of it, so that number's just going to keep growing. There's going to be quite a few more systems out there. Additionally, I think that attitudes of the various departments come into play. How a agency feels about a certain type of violation. There's some agencies that I've worked with in the past that couldn't enforce specific types of violations, or were extremely strict on other violations. As an example, when I was working for Audit, I went to Texas for training on compliance reviews and truck inspections. When I was down there, I was talking to their inspectors, and FMCSA's regulation states that drivers must be able to read and speak English to be able to operate a commercial motor vehicle in the United States, but Texas doesn't enforce that. In Oregon, we placed drivers out of service if they could not speak or communicate in English. Texas doesn't place their drivers out of service. I was talking to the troopers down there, and they said they would be placing so many drivers out of service that it would cripple the industry and have a pretty significant economic effect on the state. And the majority of the other states in the nation do place drivers out of service. So that's just kind of one example of how different states enforce different rules. Another example is with Oregon, when I was working for ODOT, very strict on hours of service. They're historically one of the top 5 states for hours of service violations and placing drivers out of service for hours of service violations. So the Oregon roadside, Oregon chose, or over the years has developed very well-trained inspectors, and they're very knowledgeable on the hours of service regulations, and they tend to take a pretty hard approach on hours of service. So as I said, depending upon the agency, drivers may run into agencies that will take the new ELD rules very seriously and enforce them to the letter of the law, and then some agencies may not be able to, may not have the resources, or may not have the training, or the it may not be one of their high priority type violations, so they may take a softer approach on the ELD rules. Another issue that may affect how DOT will enforce ELDs, that you may run into some inspectors that aren't as tech savvy as others. I myself, I'm not as tech savvy as I thought I was, and my kids are pretty quick to point that out, that I'm not very tech savvy. Others prefer to have, so some of my old coworkers at ODOT, they prefer to have like a hard copy of the logbook. They're not, they want to have a paper copy of a log that they can audit and make copies of, or make marks on. It's just easier. It's what they've been doing. It's kind of in their comfort level. And then others like to have the information emailed to them. They prefer to audit the electronic copy. It's a little bit quicker, gets the motor carrier back on the road a lot faster, and saves the driver time and also the auditor some time to get the inspector back, the driver back in the road. I think at the beginning there's going to be a learning curve for both drivers and inspectors. There will also be some technical challenges, which is to be expected when you think about an auditor going from looking at maybe 4 or 5 different 4, 5, 8 or so different electronic login devices that they're currently looking at, and now the systems are going to jump up by December. They're going to be jumping into 30 or 40, possibly 50 different systems that they're going to have to, the inspector's going to have to learn and be able to audit. And each system has its own little different intricacies and how they're going to manipulate the system to pull up the data that they need. Something else to keep in mind is that the inspector is going to be learning, like I say, the multiple systems, and they're going to, a driver only needs to learn the one system that they're using at the time, but the inspector is going to need to know all the ins and outs of the of multiple systems. So they may rely on the driver to show them how each specific device works. The inspector is going to be asking a lot of questions about how the device works, wanting to see how you manipulate the system, and really educating themselves through the driver on the different systems that they're going to be seeing. But as they progress, the inspector will become more and more proficient on the devices they see every day, and so it's going to become an easier process. But systems that they don't see every day, I see that being kind of a problem, or could create a little delay in the inspections, because if you don't see that system maybe once a month, then you're gonna take a little bit extra time to make sure that the inspector's understanding everything that they're seeing. So just kind of be patient with the DOT inspectors as a driver. Should be a common rule of thumb anyway. The inspector should be, patient, respectful, and same with the driver to the inspector. In addition to learning the ELD systems and how DOT inspectors and their agency are going to enforce the new rules, the DOT inspector is also going to need to maintain their paper log auditing skills. So I don't see that as being a huge problem for current DOT inspectors, or some of my former coworkers. They've been auditing paper logs for 20, 25 years. But I do see that possibly having an effect when, after the ELD mandate comes into place and these inspectors haven't really, maybe somebody gets hired and hasn't had the years of experience of auditing paper logs. So they're going to not be as efficient with the paper logs, and maybe not have as good an understanding as some of the seasoned inspectors. So they're just not going to have that type of level of experience. So on the occasion that you're going to have a paper log, there may be some delays in the inspection process. But as the inspectors become more efficient with auditing ELDs, they're also going to look for shortcuts, different methods to make the entire process more efficient. Another way that I feel that roadside inspections, especially on a level 3 inspection, will become shorter, and it can save the driver and the company some time and money in the long run. Some of the most important capabilities of an ELD system to a roadside inspection or inspector will be how are you going to provide the information from the ELD to the inspector so they can audit the logs. The first option is telecomatics, transferring the ELD information to the inspector via wireless web-based services or an email. And when I was doing inspections, that was kind of my preference. Especially if I was doing a level 1 or a level 2 inspection, I preferred to provide the driver with my email or a business card and ask them to email me the previous 8 days of logs, or current day and previous 7 days of logs. So then by the time I got done with the mechanical portion of the inspection, I'd just ask the driver, or I would have the driver's email the logs to me. I'd go and do my report and check the logs really quick, and it made the inspection a lot quicker, or it could possibly make the inspection a lot quicker. The second option is for local transfer to provide the logs to the inspector. And that's using like a USB port or Bluetooth or something like that. And in talking to a couple of my former coworkers, one thing that they're concerned about, though, is having some sort of virus or problem with taking a flash drive, plug it into whatever system that the company's using, and then getting some sort of a infection on that, and then putting it into their computer and having some issues there. So that's something they're going to have to work out, how that's going to, but it is an option to use that as a way to transfer your logs to the inspectors. And if there's not any way to send the email or send it by email or telematics or thumb drive or anything like that, probably my least preferred method as an inspector when I was doing roadside inspections was that you can print the logs and hard copy, or show the smartphone or tablet or whatever screen you're using to the inspector. One thing to note, though, is if you are using that route, the ELD needs to be visible to the inspector without having to get inside the truck. So you're going to need to either pass the device to them, or they step up on the rail or something and be able to view it from outside the vehicle. I just say it's my least favorite way to do it. The paper logs isn't that bad, but with viewing the screen, sometimes if you get a smartphone or something that they're using and the screen's really small, I'm getting a little older. I've got bad eyes, and sometimes it was a little bit hard for me to view those. And then you get also having to manipulate back and forth from the grid to the recap of where each change of duty status was. So you have to just bounce back and forth from screen to screen. It's not all on one screen for you to view sometimes. And that's just a personal preference of mine, though. There are some guys, like I say, some of my former coworkers really like to have the paper log and not mess with the transferring of the data. But like I say, those are all acceptable ways of providing your logbook. Each inspector may have their own preference, and just kind of make sure that you have the capability of providing it in the way that they're going to prefer. With all that being said, the complexities of the ELD system, the inspectors, I feel, are going to fall back on what they know. As they develop their knowledge and become more proficient with the ELDs, though, again, I think that that's going to just improve on and shorten up the inspection time. It's going to be a much more efficient process. You're going to have inspectors spending less time on checking for the 11 and 14-hour and 70-hour rule, because that should be all just in a recap on your screen that you can show them quickly how many hours you have available for the day and how many hours you have available for the week. But again, I think they're going to, when we start, they're going to fall back on what they know. They're going to ask for you to show them the grid, and they're going to want to see the grid where you're at, and then they're going to want to see that recap of where you're at for your hours. And part of the intent on asking you to show them the grid and also to show them the recap of the hours is just to enforce your knowledge of the device, so that they know that you know how to manipulate the device, you know how to work the device, and you can show them where you're at. Obviously, a requirement for an ELD is to know how to work the device. So then they're gonna, another thing that they're gonna do with the ELD is they're gonna spot check it. In Oregon, for ODOT, when they're checking roadside inspections and they are doing a logbook check, they're going to have their own Oregon scale crossings, but they're also going to call Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, and Colorado. And since I've left DOT, I've heard that they've expanded that out to Utah. So there's quite a few states that they can call and check for scale crossings. And when they get to the scale crossing, when they have scale crossings, they're going to just ask you to show them the day. If you had a scale crossing yesterday, they're going to say, show me yesterday's date or grid, and they're going to look at the grid and make sure that you're near or very close to that scale crossing at the specific time that the scale crossing is there. It's a very easy way to check, and again, they're watching to see how the driver can manipulate the log, the ELD, and make sure that they understand and know how to operate it. So knowing how to operate your ELD, recently I was talking to a few inspectors, excuse me, and I was talking to them about some of the problems they're seeing with the ELDs. The biggest thing that they just had a kind of an hours of service week where they spent a good portion of their time doing hours of service out at the Cascade Locks and Wythe Scale on Interstate 84 in Oregon. And one of the inspectors put 4 people out of service for just simply not knowing how to work their ELD system. Another one of the inspectors put a driver out of service for not knowing or for not having backup logs, and they had an issue with their ELD system, and then they didn't switch over to backup logs, so they basically had no record of duty status for the particular day previous to the day of the inspection. So it's very important to know the ins and outs of your system and have the manual with you in your truck along with backup logs. So some of these roadside inspections, when they didn't know how to do it, didn't know how to operate their ELD, placed the driver out of service for 10 hours just for not knowing how to work that system. Let's see. So again, just kind of talking a little bit more about the scale crossings. They're going to be checking all the scale crossings. In addition to that, they're also going to spot check it with any other receipts or bill of lading or anything that you have that's part of your trip. And then I think one of the advantages of an ELD system too is going to be that it's going to take care of a lot of and eliminate a lot of the falsifications due to errors on the driver's part. A lot of times when I was doing roadside inspections, drivers would be crossing into different time zones, and they're recording off their cell phone, the times off their cell phone, which is changing with the time zones, and that would throw them off. Not trying to purposely falsify a log, but an inadvertent falsification that throws the time off just enough to create a false log. And then also a lot of drivers that I would interview or that I would inspect at roadside inspections were waiting till the end of the day to try to recreate their logs just by GPS and how long it should take you to go from one point to the other. And that may be something that won't affect you for quite a while, but the one day that you do get inspected and you're doing that, it's going to be almost impossible to recreate that log perfectly every day and keep from having a falsification. Not that you're doing it on purpose, but it just appears that you have a falsification because you were just trying to recreate that log by where you think you were at specific times. So the ELD system will help eliminate those. General form and manner violations are very common for just not filling in the basic information. The ELD system is going to help eliminate those type of violations too, because everything should be pre-filled in. But it's always just kind of a suggestion of mine to have drivers complete a log as they go, and you have less chance of making mistakes. With that concludes the portion that I was going to talk on, and I'm going to send it back to Dave.
All right, thanks, Tony. Just wanted to take a minute and recap some of the couple of the important points that I took from Tony's description. The degree of enforcement is going to depend on the attitude of the agency. Again, like as Tony mentioned, Oregon, for example, takes a very aggressive approach to hours of service where other states don't. And I think, again, Tony mentioned budget comes into play. The FMCSA is developing software to help measure ELD data quickly. But there's a cost to that, and there's a cost to training people how to use it and having the equipment at roadside. So again, state budgets, how much money the feds will be able to give the states to buy this equipment, all of that is up in the air. So degree of enforcement when the ELD mandate hits, it's going to vary a lot by agency. And agency meaning states, different states take a different attitude towards that. I think the other points how an enforcement audit will be performed, to me, it sounds like there's going to be a lot of verbal interactions. With 40 or 50 ELDs out there, Tony mentioned the inspectors are not going to know the devices. It's going to be as if someone were to hand you 40 different smartphones and ask you to find the settings tab on each one. You could probably do it, but it would take you a while with all the different versions of phone. It would take you a while to find the settings in each one of them, and these inspectors just aren't going to be wanting to do that because it would just take too much time. Instead, they're going to ask questions and ask, okay, how many hours do you have left for today? Show me on your screen. And again, as Tony pointed out, spot checking I know you were at this location, the scale crossing 2 days ago. Show me that log on your screen from 2 days ago, and let me compare it to what I know, where I know you were at, and does it compare? So the officers aren't going to have a chance of knowing all the devices, and they're going to be doing a lot of spot checking, which does create a lot of verbal interaction. It's not going to be where the driver's just handing over a set of logs, paper logs, and the inspector goes off and audits it. It's going to be a lot of communication. So what can go wrong? And I think the key is the driver not knowing how the device works can easily be an out-of-service violation. A driver not being able to go retrieve the information that's being requested is an hours of service violation. The officers are going to know what the ELDs are supposed to produce and will simply ask to produce it. And if it can't be done, it's an hours of service violation. And then the other day we were talking about, between Tony and I, we were talking about his example of where English not being the primary first language of many drivers. There's many excellent drivers where English isn't their first language, and a lot of them have a good command of English, some of them not so much. So in the case of like his example of Texas, where they don't really enforce that, so what is going to happen in an ELD inspection where there needs to be a lot of verbal communication? If that verbal communication can't happen because the English is not good enough, then maybe they're not put out of service for not understanding English, but it certainly could be an hours of service violation for not knowing how the device works or be able to retrieve the information. So we think the English language rule, which some states enforce, some states don't, is going to move away from being a lack of knowledge of English violation to more of an hours of service violation because of the need to communicate just where they're at with their ELD, because the officers aren't going to be taking the devices and being able to just automatically scroll and find that page where the information is. There's just too many different devices out there, and it's simply going to be asking the questions. So that could be another concern. All right, next slide. All right, let's get to the last couple slides here. Driver ELD quick tips, and I guess the main one for the driver is you need to do your homework. You need to know your ELD system. You need to be able to show the officer, where your current hours are, where your log grid from the previous day. Know how to email your logs to a particular email address when asked. You really need to do that homework, to understand, because the officer is going to ask you to do it, and if you can't do it, it becomes a violation. So Tony mentioned you need to have an ELD manual on hand as part of the rule. If there's no manual in the truck, it can't be found, it's a violation. Know how to troubleshoot within your manual. Know what your manual says, and so if you're being asked something and you can't quite remember how to do it, you've never had to do it before, you know enough about the manual to go and say, okay, here's the step-by-step, this is how I go do it, and use the manual. Make sure you have paper logs as backups. As Tony mentioned, that's another requirement of the ELD mandate, is that you have a book of paper logs in your truck. And the first questions asked are probably going to be, show me your paper logs, show me your manual. If those two things can't be produced readily, the audit is going to go downhill quickly. And realize most law enforcement will be learning from you, learning your device from you. They will be asking you the questions, and you as the driver will be showing them the information that's being requested. All right, so let's move on to some carrier ELD quick tips. So you as the carrier, it's all about your internal controls. And first internal control is picking the right device. There's a big, huge buyer beware exclamation point with picking the right device. We touched on it a little bit earlier. Again, there's going to be 40 to 50 different devices to pick from. There are going to be many of them. If you went to the list right now, you would be hard-pressed to read a company name on there that you recognize. eRoad just became certified, and they are on the list. I think that's the one telematics device that I recognize. The rest are startups. They're trying to take advantage of being first to market and hoping that they're going to survive. And you've got to know that in the coming months, especially after the ELD mandate happens and most everybody's picked their device, there's going to be winners and losers as providers. And you want to make sure you're on the winning side so you don't have to re-buy your device. As a carrier, you should really plan on a transition to ELDs versus all in. Everything I read from the carriers that have done it, it is a transition. If you can do 5, 10 drivers at a time and do it over a period of time, it's much better than just saying, if you're a fleet of 100, okay, all 100, we're starting, everybody's going to have it starting tomorrow. Very, very tough to do it that way. You'd save yourself a lot of headache by planning a transition versus all in. You need to plan for ongoing driver training. As you have heard, being able to do as instructed and get the data as instructed from the enforcement officer is going to be key. And obviously the trucking industry is prone to turnover. A lot of drivers coming and going. You've got to have a good internal program to train your drivers, or use a third party to help you train your drivers. Typically the manufacturers of the ELD devices, they're going to give you the manual, but they're not going to provide driver training to any degree. They'll train management, and then after that the expectation is that management will do the training from there. You're going to need an internal system for handling driver edits. As I mentioned, the only thing automatic is driving time. The rest have to have driver interactions. And again, in our example, if the driver fails to interact and it just leaves him or her in on duty mode and they go to bed, they're going to wake up in the morning with no available hours. And you certainly don't want to go to a scale with no available hours showing on your screen. The drivers will have edit. The back office will have edit capabilities. You guys need, the carriers need to have a procedure and a process on how to do those edits. And again, third parties can help with that. And obviously, again, provide your drivers the ELD manuals and the paper logs. So those are requirements, and as the carrier with drivers out there, you need to provide those for your drivers. All right, Luke, we kind of went through that quickly. Has anybody turned in any questions?
Yeah, and so real quick, thank you, Dave and Tony, for talking on the subject. If you do have any other questions, there's a couple questions that came in. If you have any other questions, please write them down in the chat box. The first question was, when is Oregon adopting the ELD mandate for interstate carriers?
All right, I think I can answer that one. Oregon, and every state does it a bit differently, but Oregon every year has to adopt and into statute, Oregon statute, what it's going to enforce within the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. So in years past, and I know just this year, attended a meeting 2 weeks ago where they adopted all of the parts of the FMCSRs, including all of 395, which is the Hours of Service Regulations. So Oregon has adopted Part 395 of the Federal Motor Carrier Regulations, meaning all the rules and parts within 395, which includes the ELD, Oregon is adopting. There was no exceptions. In other parts, they have had some exceptions, but within the ELD mandate, Oregon, everything that I've heard in the meetings that I've attended with them is they're adopting it lock, stock, and barrel.
Great. And so a second question came in more on the supporting paperwork part that Tony mentioned. They say currently the officer cannot have the receipts unless they see them. Is he saying that now can inspectors request the receipts without seeing them?
I don't, and Tony, you might be able to help me out on this one as an inspector. I don't, I don't think that has changed at all. I don't think there's anything new within the rule as far as the officer can ask to see, start fishing around and asking for stuff that really doesn't know that's there. If it's part of the packet, can they check it? Sure. I know supporting documents is part of the ELD mandate. I think they lessened the number required by 1 or 2, which is not much in my opinion, but supporting documents are still required. So Tony, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, it's a little bit. So basically, the FMCSA regulations say that you are required to provide documents upon request to an inspector when they are doing an inspection. And I guess a couple different sides of it. From the driver's perspective, you tell them, no, I don't have any supporting documents. I'm just going to use my experience and what I would do in a situation like that as an example. I'm going to ask the driver for supporting documents. It is as an inspector, I was authorized to ask for supporting documents. It doesn't have to do with whether I can see them or not. It's like David mentioned, if you have a trip pack and you're throwing all your receipts in this envelope, and I say, can I see your trip pack? You hand me the trip pack. I'm going to look at all those documents. If you tell me at one point, nope, I'm not going to provide them to you, I might ask 1 or 2 more times later in the conversation. If I get them, great. If not, then I'm going to move on. That's just the way that I did it. A lot of times too, I would ask for, especially if a carrier is coming into Portland, dropping off a load and then heading back out, and I am out outside of Portland on your trip leaving Portland, I'm going to ask for your previous bill of lading at the same time. A lot of times that trip pack's in the truck somewhere, and that is going to have additional documents that I'm going to want to see. Plain and simple, the DOT officers are trying to find a document to say that you were at a certain place at a certain time on whatever date. There is no requirement for you to provide them. It says the FMCSA regulations are a little vague in this area. It says that you are, I can't remember the exact terminology. I was actually looking for it when Dave was talking. That you're not required to provide them, but you should provide the supporting documents. You are required to maintain supporting documents. So whether you provide them for the DOT officer or not, it's kind of a choice that you're going to make. But the thing that I don't want you to be confused on is whether they can see them or not. It has nothing to do with them seeing them. They're going to request them, and whether you provide them is going to be kind of what, however much you provide to the DOT inspector is going to be, your company policy or your prerogative.
It sounds like, yeah, I just was going to add, it sounds like, if the inspection's going bad and they want supporting documents, if you don't provide them, it obviously could not win you any points and not be able to prove that you were correct. So the violation would then be justified. If you had supporting documents that could get you out of the, actually prove where you were at, and it's not a false log, then that could help you. And not providing, choosing not to provide, seems like it would be more hurtful than helpful.
Yeah, exactly. There's times when the supporting documents could help you, and if you're unwilling to provide the documents to a DOT inspector and they know you have documents, that's just raising a red flag that you have something you're hiding, and they're going to find somewhere else to look.
We have time for one more question. The question is, when you say that you have to have paper logs on board, do you mean printed out copies of the days prior, or do you mean blank copies in case of equipment failure?
Good question. It's blank copies. You need to be able to convert over to paper logs should your ELD malfunction. So they don't need to be, a duplicate of what your ELD says, or just blanks that you could then put into play in case that your ELD failed for whatever reason.
Perfect. So before we wrap up, I do want to thank Dave and Tony again. So thank you guys for talking on the subject. Are you still researching an ELD solution? Glowstone's done the research for you. You can see what we found at glowstone.com/geotab. And again, the presentation slides will be sent to you in the email tomorrow. And finally, we also do have some upcoming webinars for both Glowstone and CleanFleet on the drug testing side. Next month, Tuesday the 18th for Glowstone, it's hours of service rules and exemptions. You can come to our website. The link is here below. And on Thursday, April 20th, CleanFleet's going to be doing what is oral testing and why should I care? Oral testing should be coming down the road, some say as early as October of this year, to be allowed as a viable source of drug testing for the DOT. So something that you guys might want to jump in on. You can register online or find out more information at the 2 links provided below. Again, I will email them to you. So with that, I'd like to conclude this webinar. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.